"You're too old to understand real business," she said, and the whole kitchen went still around that sentence like water, closing over a dropped stone. The refrigerator kept humming behind her. Nobody moved. My son Daniel stared down at his coffee like it had personally betrayed him, and his wife Vanessa just stood there in her yoga clothes at 9 in the morning, arms crossed, waiting for me to shrink. I have been talked down to by men who wore better suits than she'll ever own, and I have let every one of them think they'd won. I am 62 years old, and people have been mistaking my quiet for stupidity since I was 26. Standing in a county records office with dust on my hands, learning how to read the small print that ruins families. 3 days before that morning in the kitchen, my phone rang at 11:47 p.m., and Daniel's voice on the other end sounded like a man standing on a ledge. He said he needed $30,000 by Friday, or he was going to lose the shop. He said the landlord was done waiting. He said everything he'd built for 6 years was about to disappear, and he needed me. And could I please just trust him this one time without asking 100 questions? I told him I would help. I did not tell him that 30 years of reading property records for a living had already put a small, cold splinter of doubt somewhere behind my ribs, right where it always starts. Here is the promise of this story, and I am not going to make you wait for it. Someone was going to pay for what happened in that kitchen and in that empty building, and it was going to happen in front of the entire town, at the very event they were using my money to throw. But before any of that, you should know 3 things were wrong with Daniel's story from the very first sentence, and I didn't say a word about any of them. My name is Gerald Whitfield. Everyone who's known me more than a week calls me Jerry. I spent 31 years as a property title examiner, first for Hendricks County, and then for a private firm that handled commercial closings across 3 states. It is not a job that makes anyone rich. It is a job that teaches you, slowly and permanently, that the truth about a piece of property is never in what people tell you. It's in the recorded documents. Liens get filed. Leases get terminated. Notices go up on doors whether anyone reads them or not. I spent 3 decades finding the gap between what a seller claimed and what the county recorder's office actually had on file, and more often than I'd like to admit, that gap was where somebody's whole life was quietly being taken from them. I raised Daniel mostly on my own after his mother Margaret died 4 years ago. A stroke, sudden, on a Tuesday afternoon while she was watering the tomatoes in the backyard. I found her there when I got home from the grocery store, and I have never once, in 4 years, been able to walk past that spot in the yard without my chest tightening. Margaret was the one who kept our small house feeling like something more than 4 walls and a mortgage. She wrote things down, recipes, birthdays, little pieces of advice for Daniel and for the grandchildren she never got to meet. She left behind a battered spiral notebook I still keep on my nightstand, and there's one line in it, near the back, that I didn't understand the weight of until this whole thing started. Don't let love turn into control. Watch for it in the people who say they love him most. Daniel opened his shop, Whitfield Precision Auto, 6 years ago, doing custom restoration and detail work out of a converted warehouse on the east side of town. I helped him with the down payment on the lease back then. $11,000 I'd saved from overtime work. The kind of money that takes a working man years to set aside quietly, dollar by dollar, without making a show of it. He married Vanessa Cole 2 years later. She was pretty and sharp-tongued and ambitious in a way that made her seem exciting. At first, the kind of ambitious that turns out later to mean something closer to hungry. I never said anything against her to Daniel. A father learns fast that criticizing your son's wife only builds the wall higher between you and him. So I smiled at holidays. I complimented her cooking even when it wasn't very good. I told myself that was love. That night, after Daniel's call, I lay awake with the ceiling fan turning slow circles above me and did the thing I have always done when something doesn't sit right. I made a list in my head. Whitfield Precision Auto had been doing well as of the last time I'd actually driven past it, back in the spring. 4 months ago now, if I was honest with myself. Daniel hadn't mentioned any trouble at Sunday dinner 3 weeks earlier. He'd mentioned, in fact, that business was steady, that he'd just brought on a part-time apprentice. A business does not go from steady to collapse in 3 weeks without something specific happening, and specific things leave paper behind them. That's the whole of what I know how to do. Find the paper. I didn't say any of that to Daniel. I told him I'd have the money ready by Friday. And then, because 31 years of habit does not turn off just because the man on the other end of the phone is your own son, I decided I would drive out to the shop myself first thing in the morning. Not to check up on him, I told myself, just to see it. Just to understand what I was actually putting $30,000 into. I want you to sit with 3 questions while I tell you the rest of this, because I sat with them for a long time myself. Was the crisis Daniel described to me on the phone even real? If it wasn't real, who had been lying to him, and for how long? And the one that kept me up longest of all. If my son had been standing in the middle of a lie this large, was he the one telling it, or was he the one it was being told to? I got up before dawn. I didn't wake anyone, because there wasn't anyone else in that house to wake. I made coffee in the same chipped mug Margaret always used to tease me about, poured it into a thermos, and drove the 18 minutes across town to the east side, to the converted warehouse with the faded blue sign that still read WIT. Filed Priscian's auto in letters Daniel had picked out himself 6 years ago. Standing in my driveway with a laptop, showing me font samples like it was the most important decision of his life. In a lot of ways it had been. The sun was just coming up when I pulled into the gravel lot. And the first thing I noticed, before I'd even put the truck in park, was that there were no lights on inside. Not the front office light Daniel always left burning. Not the bay lights that hummed all day behind the garage doors. The whole building sat dark and still against the gray morning sky, and something in my stomach dropped the way it does when you're walking down a staircase and your foot finds air where a step should be. I got out and walked to the front door. The glass was dusty in a way that doesn't happen in 3 weeks. It happens in months. I cupped my hands against the window and looked inside, and what I saw stopped me cold on that gravel lot, with my breath fogging in front of my face. The showroom floor was bare concrete, no tools, no lift equipment, no half-finished cars up on jack stands, no parts bins, no calendar on the wall, nothing. Just empty space and a thin film of dust catching the first gray light of morning, and a single folding chair knocked over on its side in the middle of the room, like someone had left in a hurry, or like no one had been in that room to knock it upright again in a very long time. I stood there for a long moment. Then I noticed the paper. It was taped to the inside of the glass door, at eye level, the kind of official notice that gets stapled to doors in movies, but rarely in real life. Except this was very real and very official, printed on letterhead from a property management company I didn't recognize. I didn't need to go inside to read most of it. Order of lease termination, it said in bold block letters at the top, and below that, a date. I stood in that gravel lot in the cold morning air and did the math in my head, the same way I'd done it 10,000 times across a desk covered in deeds and closing statements. The date on that notice was 4 months old. 4 months. Not 3 weeks. Not the steady business Daniel had described to me over Sunday dinner. 4 months since this shop had been shut down, locked, and abandoned, and every single day since then, my son had been coming home to Vanessa and telling everyone, that Whitfield Precision Auto was open, was steady, was thriving. I reached out and touched the edge of that notice through the glass, not able to open the door, just needing to feel that it was real and not some trick of the early light. My hand was shaking. I want to be honest with you about that. It wasn't the cold. I didn't call Daniel right away. I sat in my truck in that gravel lot for almost 20 minutes, engine off, watching the sun climb a little higher over a building that had been dead for a season while my son stood in my kitchen and begged me for money to save it. I thought about Margaret's handwriting in that spiral notebook. Watch for it in the people who say they love him most. I thought about the $11,000 I'd handed him for that down payment 6 years ago, and how proud I'd been walking out of that meeting with the landlord, watching my boy sign his name on a lease, like a grown man building something that was his. And I thought with a coldness that surprised even me, that whatever was happening here was not going to be solved by writing a check. I drove home. I did not call Daniel that morning, and I did not call Vanessa. Instead, I did the only thing I have ever really known how to do when the truth is buried somewhere under paperwork. I went to my desk, the same oak desk I'd had since before Margaret passed, and I opened my laptop, and I started pulling records. This part I want to explain honestly because it matters. Everything I looked at that morning was public record: property tax filings, business license status through the county clerk's website, UCC filings on file with the Secretary of State, which anyone can search, which show whether a business has pledged its equipment as collateral for a loan. I did not access anyone's private bank account. I did not hack anything. Did not call in favors from old friends, still working the records office to pull anything that wasn't already open to any citizen, with a library card and 45 minutes. I had built my entire career on knowing exactly where the line was between public record and private information, and old habits, the good ones anyway, do not disappear just because your hands are shaking. What I found took my breath away twice in the space of 1 hour. First, the business license for Whitfield Precision Auto had lapsed 4 months and 6 days earlier, 1 day before the date on that termination notice. Second, and this was the one that made me set my coffee down and stare at the screen for a long time, there was a UCC filing showing that the shop's equipment, the lifts, the compressors, the diagnostic machines Daniel had spent 3 years paying off, had been sold as collateral to satisfy a personal loan, not a business loan. A personal loan taken out in Vanessa's name 4.5 months earlier for $18,000. The shop hadn't just closed. It had been quietly cannibalized piece by piece and sold off to cover a debt that had nothing to do with fixing cars. I sat back in my chair and looked at the framed photograph on my desk, the one from Daniel's high school graduation, him grinning with his arm around his mother, both of them squinting into the sun. I thought about how many nights I'd told myself that staying quiet, staying out of my son's marriage, was the same thing as respecting him. I thought about the phone call 3 nights earlier, his voice cracking on the other end of the line, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that my son had not lied to me on that call. He believed every word he had told me. Someone else had built the lie, brick by brick, and handed it to him to carry into my kitchen. I picked up the phone to call Ruth Okafor, who had been Margaret's closest friend for 30 years and who happened to also be the best estate and family attorney in 3 counties. Semi-retired now, but never too retired to pick up when I called. I didn't tell her everything yet. I just asked her to clear an hour for me that afternoon, and something in my voice must have told her not to ask why, because she just said, "Come by at 2, and hung up. Before I left the house, I did one more thing. I went to my nightstand and picked up Margaret's notebook, opened it to that page near the back, and read the line again, slower this time. Don't let love turn into control. Watch for it in the people who say they love him most." I closed the notebook, put it back exactly where it had been, and for the first time since that phone call 3 nights ago, I felt something underneath the fear and the anger, something steadier. I had spent 31 years learning how to find the truth buried under other people's paperwork. I was not going to let anyone, not Vanessa, not whoever else turned out to be standing behind her, bury my son under a lie built on my dead wife's grandchildren's inheritance, my son's business, and my own quiet trust. I didn't know it yet, but that folding chair lying on its side in an empty building was only the first thing I'd find that morning that someone had knocked over trying to leave in a hurry. I got in my truck and drove toward Ruth's office, and somewhere behind me, in a kitchen across town, my son was probably still asleep, with no idea at all that his father had already found the empty building and was only just getting started. Ruth Okafor's office sat above a bakery on 5th Street, and even at 2 in the afternoon the whole staircase smelled like cinnamon, which felt almost cruel given what I was about to lay out on her desk. She'd known me since before Daniel was born. She'd sat with me at Margaret's funeral, hadn't said much, just held my hand through the whole service, and that kind of history buys you the right to walk into someone's office and say things you can't say anywhere else. I laid it all out for her. The phone call, the empty shop, the lease terminations, notice 4 months old, the lapsed business license, The UCC filing showing Daniel's equipment sold off to satisfy an $18,000 personal loan taken out in Vanessa's name. Ruth listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys and good listeners both learn to do, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting I couldn't read upside down. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me for a long moment. "Gary," she said, "does Daniel know any of this?" That was the question, wasn't it? That was the one sitting right in the center of everything. "I don't think so," I said. "I think he called me 3 nights ago, believing every word he told me." "Then you have 2 problems," Ruth said. "You have a financial problem, which I can help you with. And you have a much harder problem, which is that somebody has been lying to your son for months, inside his own marriage, and you're about to walk into the middle of that with evidence in your hand. That's not a business matter anymore, Jerry. That's going to break something." I told her I understood that. I told her I'd rather it break now, cleanly, than keep rotting quietly for another 4 months while my son handed over money to save something that was already gone. Ruth pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and started a list of her own. "First," she said, "before I did anything else, I needed to protect what was left. If Daniel's business assets had already been used as collateral once, there was nothing stopping whoever was managing his affairs from doing it again, to his truck, to the modest retirement account he'd started 3 years ago, even to the small life insurance policy he and Vanessa held jointly. Ruth drafted a letter that afternoon, one I would deliver personally, establishing a short-term protective trust over the $30,000 I'd promised him, meaning the money existed, meaning I hadn't lied to my son, but meaning it could only be released for verified business expenses tied to an actual operating business, not simply wired into a joint account controlled by someone else. It wasn't punishment. It was a wall, and I built it that afternoon with Ruth's help, quietly, the same way I'd have shored up a foundation before a storm. She told me to keep gathering records, but to be careful. Everything I'd found so far was public. If I wanted to go further, if I wanted to understand where that $18,000 loan had actually gone, who Vanessa owed money to, why a woman with a modest part-time job at a marketing firm had needed to borrow against her husband's equipment in the first place, I would need to do that through documentation that crossed my path honestly, not through anything that could later be called spying. "You built your whole career on knowing where that line is," Ruth said. "Don't lose it now because you're angry." I told her I wouldn't. I meant it when I said it. Third, and this was the part Ruth said the longest, the part I could tell she'd been turning over the whole time I talked. She told me not to confront Vanessa alone, and not to confront her yet. "Whatever's happening here," Ruth said, "it's bigger than one bad loan. Nobody quietly liquidates their husband's business over 4 months and keeps lying about it every single week unless they're covering something they're terrified of him finding. You find out what that is before you say a single word to her. Otherwise, all you'll do is warn her, and she'll bury it deeper." I drove home from Ruth's office with the protective trust papers on the passenger seat and a knot in my chest that hadn't loosened since that gravel lot at dawn. And I want to be honest about something here, because it's the kind of thing I've never said out loud to anyone, not even Ruth. There is a particular kind of shame that comes from realizing you've spent years being polite to someone instead of paying attention to them. I had spent 6 years smiling at Vanessa across Thanksgiving tables, complimenting a store-bought pie she'd passed off as homemade, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, telling myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as being a good father-in-law. I hadn't asked a single hard question in 6 years. That was on me. I have never once, in this whole story, told myself I was blameless. And I won't start now. That evening, before I could decide how or when to talk to Daniel, he called me first. His voice was different this time, not panicked like the first call, but hollow, flat, like a man walking through a house after a flood, cataloging what's ruined. He said Vanessa had told him something that afternoon that didn't sit right with him. She'd told him the landlord had finally agreed to work with them once my money came through, that the shop would be back open within a month. And Daniel, standing in his own kitchen, holding his phone, had asked her a question he told me he'd never once thought to ask in 4 months. Could he see the new lease agreement? She'd told him she'd have it by the weekend. "Dad," he said, and I heard something in his voice crack open just slightly. I drove past the shop on my way home. It's been dark for a long time, longer than 3 weeks. I think I already knew that, and I don't know why I never let myself really look at it. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Vanessa had told me 2 mornings earlier that I was too old to understand real business. I told my son the truth, all of it. The lease termination, the lapsed license, the UCC filing, the $18,000 loan in her name alone. I told him about Ruth, about the protective trust, about everything I'd done in the last 36 hours to make sure whatever happened next, he wouldn't be left standing with nothing. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. I let myself not look, he finally said, quiet, almost to himself. Every time something felt wrong, I told myself I was being paranoid. She'd get upset if I asked too many questions about money, so I just stopped asking. I told myself that was respect. I think it was just easier. I want to tell you something about my son in this moment because it matters, and because I think it's the part of this story people rush past when they're only interested in the villain getting what's coming to her. Daniel was not a fool, and he was not a coward. Not the way people mean it when they say that word like a slap. He was a man who had lost his mother 4 years earlier and had spent every year since trying to build something solid enough that nothing could ever collapse under him again, the way that Tuesday afternoon had collapsed under all of us. And somewhere in that need for solid ground, he had let himself stop asking the one question that might have shaken it. I understood that, sitting in my kitchen, better than I wanted to. Grief does not make a man weak. It makes him choose, very carefully, which truths he can afford to look at, and Daniel had chosen wrong, the same way I had chosen wrong for 6 years of polite Thanksgiving dinners. He asked me what he should do. I told him the only thing I actually knew for certain. Don't say anything to her yet. Come by tomorrow evening, and we'll figure out together what we're actually standing in the middle of. He came by the next evening, and that's when I finally told him about Preston Vance. I hadn't planned on finding Preston. He'd surfaced almost by accident, the way the worst things always seem to, tucked inside a public court filing I'd pulled that afternoon while double-checking the UCC record. Vanessa's $18,000 personal loan hadn't come from a bank. It had come from a private lending arrangement, the kind that gets structured through a small LLC to avoid the scrutiny a bank would apply, and the LLC in question, Vance Capital Advisory, had one listed managing member, Preston Vance, 41 years old, according to the state business registry. A man who, it turned out from a second court filing I found 20 minutes later, had 2 prior civil judgments against him for defaulted debts of his own, filed in a county 2 hours south, under a slightly different spelling of his name. I didn't know yet, sitting across the table from Daniel that evening, exactly what Preston Vance was to Vanessa. I only knew that a man with a history of borrowed money he couldn't repay had somehow become the person lending $18,000 to my son's wife, secured against my son's business equipment, and that felt like the kind of thread you pull on very, very carefully. Daniel didn't recognize the name at first. Then something moved across his face, slow, like a stone dropping through dark water. "There's a guy from her old job," he said. "Marketing conference stuff. She talks about him sometimes. Preston. I met him once, maybe 2 years ago, at a holiday party. I didn't think anything of it. Neither had I when I first heard the name. That's the trouble with these things. They never announce themselves. They arrive dressed as a coworker, an old friend, a business contact, someone perfectly reasonable to mention in passing at a holiday party, and it's only months later, staring at a court, filing with your son's kitchen light burning behind you, that you understand you'd been looking at the beginning of something all along and hadn't known to be afraid of it. I told Daniel I thought Vanessa was in some kind of financial trouble that had nothing to do with the shop, and that Preston Vance was somehow tangled up in it, and that the shop's closure and the sale of the equipment might not have been about saving the business at all. It might have been about covering something else entirely, something she was terrified of him, or me, or anyone, finding. Daniel sat very still for a long moment, staring at his hands on my kitchen table, the same table his mother used to sit at doing crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings. Then he said something I've thought about many times since. "I keep waiting to feel angry," he said. "I don't yet. I think I'm still hoping there's an explanation that makes this not what it looks like." I told him I understood that too well. I'd spent 31 years reading documents that told people things they didn't want to hear, and in all that time, I never once got used to the moment right before someone realizes the ground under them isn't solid. It doesn't get easier to watch. It only gets easier to recognize. We didn't have a plan yet, not really, not the plan that would eventually put every one of them in the same room at once. What we had that night was a decision. Daniel would go home and behave exactly as he had been behaving, worried, waiting, trusting, for one more week, while I worked with Ruth to quietly build a fuller picture of where the rest of that borrowed money had actually gone, and where Preston Vance actually fit into his wife's life. It felt, honestly, like asking my son to walk back into a burning house and pretend he didn't smell the smoke. I didn't like asking it of him. But Ruth had been right the day before, warned Vanessa too soon, and whatever was underneath all of this would simply get buried deeper, and we'd never find it. Before Daniel left that night, he stopped at the door and looked back at me, and for just a moment he looked exactly like he had at 7 years old, the year his mother taught him to ride a bike in the driveway, that same face he made right before he'd fall and try not to cry about it. "Dad," he said, "I should have looked sooner. I should have asked her for that lease agreement 4 months ago, not 4 days ago. I think some part of me already knew, and I let myself not know, because knowing would have meant everything I built might already be gone." I told him what I believed then and still believe now, that a man choosing not to look at something terrifying is not the same thing as a man building the trap that's waiting for him. Those are different failures, carrying very different weights, and only one of them deserved what was coming. He drove home. I sat alone at my table for a long time after he left, Margaret's notebook open in front of me again, that one line staring back up at me under the kitchen light. "Don't let love turn into control. Watch for it in the people who say they love him most." I understood, finally, sitting there, that she hadn't just been writing a general warning into a notebook meant for grandchildren she'd never meet. She'd been writing something she'd seen the shape of already, some early version of it, years before any of us had names to put to it. I don't know if she ever suspected Vanessa specifically. I'll never know that. But my wife had understood something about love curdling into control long before the rest of us caught up to it, and it took her handwriting on a page to make me finally trust my own instincts enough to keep pulling this thread all the way to the end. I didn't know it yet, but the fuller picture Ruth and I went looking for over the following days would turn out to be far worse than an $18,000 loan, and a man with 2 prior judgments against him. It would turn out that Preston Vance wasn't simply lending Vanessa money. He was the one who had told her, months earlier, exactly how to make an old man like me hand over $30,000 without ever once asking to see a lease. It took Ruth 11 days to build the fuller picture, and every one of those days I spent doing the only thing I knew how to do well, waiting quietly, watching records, and having Sunday dinner with Vanessa and Daniel like nothing had changed at all. That dinner, 6 days into the investigation, was the hardest hour I have ever sat through in that woman's presence. She served pot roast. She talked about a friend's baby shower she was helping plan. She asked me, with what looked to anyone else in the world like genuine warmth, whether I'd had any luck finding a contractor to fix the fence in my backyard. And I told her I was still looking, and I smiled, and underneath the table my hand was pressed flat against my knee to keep it from shaking. I have negotiated closings with men who tried to cheat elderly widows out of their homes. I have sat across desks from developers who thought a title examiner was just an obstacle to be charmed past. None of it prepared me for how hard it is to eat pot roast across from someone actively lying to your son while your son sits beside her, quietly rebuilding, day by day, the courage to ask her a direct question. That night, driving home, I called Ruth from the truck. "I don't know how much longer he can do this," I said. He's not built for this kind of waiting. Neither am I, honestly. 3 more days, Ruth said. I think I know what I'm about to find, and if I'm right, you're going to want every piece of it in hand before either of you says a word to her. She was right about what she found, and it was worse than either of us had let ourselves imagine. Preston Vance was not, as it turned out, simply a private lender operating a shady LLC out of a strip mall office 2 counties over. He was a man who had spent the better part of 6 years running a very specific kind of business, dressed up as investment consulting, that preyed almost exclusively on people just like Vanessa, people carrying quiet debt they were too ashamed to admit to their spouses, people convinced that one clever move, one smart loan, one aggressive bet on the right opportunity would fix everything before anyone had to know it had ever been broken. Ruth found 3 other civil complaints against him from women in similar situations, all settled quietly, all sealed under non-disclosure terms that kept his name out of any headline, that might have warned someone like Vanessa away from him before it was too late. But the part that made my stomach turn wasn't Preston's history. It was what Ruth found tucked inside the settlement terms of one of those earlier cases, a clause, standard in these predatory arrangements apparently, requiring the borrower to maintain, quote, a plausible business narrative to justify continued fund transfers to family members. In plain language, Preston didn't just lend Vanessa money to cover a debt she already owed him from an earlier bad bet he'd talked her into. He had coached her, step by step, on exactly how to keep milking new money out of her husband's family by keeping the shop's collapse a secret and inventing an ongoing crisis that always needed just a little more, always just enough to cover the last hole without ever actually closing it. The $18,000 from the equipment sale hadn't gone to save the business. It had gone to Preston to cover a debt Vanessa had taken on 8 months earlier, gambling on a cryptocurrency scheme he'd personally talked her into, one that had collapsed and taken her savings with it. And the $30,000 she was pushing Daniel to extract from me wasn't for the shop either. According to a text message thread, Ruth's investigator found referenced in a separate court exhibit from Preston's most recent case, evidence that had become part of the public court record, lawfully accessible. Not anything either of us went digging for improperly. Preston needed $30,000 within the month to settle his own debt with someone considerably less patient than a bank. A debt serious enough that he'd used the phrase, "This isn't the kind of people who send letters," in a message to Vanessa 2 weeks before Daniel ever called me at 11:47 at night. My son had been asked to sacrifice his father's savings, his mother's memory, and the shop he'd built with his own hands to bail out the man his wife was having an affair with, from a debt to people dangerous enough that a woman with no history of fear in her voice had used the word "please" 3 times in one text message. Ruth called me the evening she confirmed all of it, and I sat in my kitchen listening to her lay it out in that calm, careful attorney's voice she uses even when the news underneath it is anything but calm, and when she finished, I didn't say anything for a long time. "Gary," she finally said, "are you still there?" I told her I was. I told her I was thinking about something Margaret used to say back before I ever had a reason to understand it fully, that the cruelest lies are never built out of nothing. They're built out of somebody's real fear, dressed up to look like somebody else's emergency. Vanessa's fear had been real. What she'd done with it wasn't. I asked Ruth one more thing before we hung up that night, and it's the question that decided everything that came after. I asked her whether, once we brought all of this into the light, there was any lawful way to make sure Daniel walked away from this with something intact. His name off any debt tied to Preston's schemes, his equipment or its value recovered where possible, some real accounting for what had actually been taken from him over these 4 months instead of simply forgiven and forgotten in the chaos of a blown-up marriage. Ruth said there was, but it would take exactly the kind of documentation and public exposure that a private, quiet divorce filing would never force into daylight. If we wanted real accountability, not just for Vanessa, but enough pressure on Preston that he couldn't simply vanish into his next town and his next mark, it needed to happen in front of enough people that nobody involved could pretend afterward it hadn't happened exactly the way it happened. That was when I first thought about the reopening, because here is the thing about Vanessa that I hadn't fully understood until Ruth laid out that final piece of the picture. She wasn't just planning to take my $30,000 and quietly disappear the debt. She was already telling people, telling our extended family, telling neighbors, telling half the congregation at the church. Daniel and I still attended out of habit more than devotion, that Whitfield Precision Auto was reopening. She'd started calling it a community celebration, a grand reopening with the local paper invited, with a ribbon Daniel would cut, with punch and cookies, and half the block showing up to celebrate the Whitfield family's resilience. She had scheduled it for 3 weeks out. She needed my $30,000 to exist, publicly, believably, before that date, because the entire performance depended on it. She had built herself a stage. She just didn't know yet that I planned to be standing on it when the curtain went up. I want to tell you about the days that followed, because they were not easy ones. And I think it does a disservice to pretend a story like this moves in a straight line from discovery to triumph without anything in between that costs a person something. Daniel came to me 4 days later, and for the first time since this whole thing began, I watched my son cry. Not the quiet, controlled kind of crying men our family does at funerals, jaw tight, eyes wet, nothing said out loud. He sat at my kitchen table and put his face in his hands and made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was maybe 9 years old the year his dog died. I didn't say anything at first. I just put my hand on his shoulder and let him get to the bottom of it in his own time, the way Margaret always used to do for both of us. When he finally spoke, what he said wasn't about Vanessa or Preston or the money. It was about himself. I keep thinking about how many times I told her business was fine, he said, when it wasn't fine, because I didn't want to admit to her, or to you, or to myself, that I was scared it was failing on its own before any of this. Maybe if I'd told the truth about that 8 months ago, none of the rest of this would have had room to happen. I have thought about that sentence many times since, because I think it's the truest thing anyone said in this entire story, and I don't want to pretend it away in favor of a simpler villain and victim version of events. My son had his own fear he'd been keeping hidden, months before Vanessa ever met Preston Vance. A fear that his business, the thing he'd built to prove to himself that he could stand on his own, 2 feet after losing his mother, might not be strong enough to survive on its own merits. He hadn't lied the way Vanessa lied, but he had gone quiet in the same places she'd gone quiet, both of them protecting themselves from a truth neither wanted to look at directly, and it had left a door open that someone far more calculating than either of them had walked straight through. You made a mistake keeping that from me, I told him, and I meant it as gently as I've ever meant anything hard. But a mistake made out of fear isn't the same thing as a lie built out of appetite. You're going to have to forgive yourself for the first one. I'm not going to let anyone confuse you with someone who did the second. We spent that evening, and several after it, planning, Ruth, Daniel, and me, around my kitchen table, the same table where all of this had started with a stranger telling me I was too old to understand real business. Ruth structured the legal groundwork carefully. Documentation of the fraudulent loan, of the equipment sale, of the pattern Preston had run through 3 prior victims, all assembled into something that could be handed, cleanly and immediately, to both a family law attorney and, separately, to the district attorney's financial crimes division, the moment it needed to be. Daniel, for his part, made a decision I respected more than almost anything else in this whole story. He refused to let this become only about punishing Vanessa. He insisted, and Ruth agreed, that whatever happened at that reopening event needed to leave room, afterward, for Vanessa to be held accountable through the actual legal system rather than simply humiliated in front of the town and left to fend for herself. I don't want to destroy her, he told me. I want the lying to stop. Those aren't the same thing, and I need you to help me keep them separate, because on my own, right now, I'm not sure I can. That request changed the shape of everything I'd been quietly planning to do. I had spent 11 days assembling a case with the precision of a man building a legal filing. My son reminded me, at exactly the right moment, that I was not simply the majority shareholder settling a corporate account. I was a father, standing at the edge of watching his son's marriage collapse in public, and there is a difference between justice and spectacle that I needed to hold on to, carefully, all the way to the end. 3 days before the reopening, I drove out to the shop one more time, alone, in the early evening light. The lease termination notice was still taped inside that glass door, exactly where I'd first found it, catching the last orange light of the day. I stood there for a long time, looking through the dusty glass at that overturned folding chair, still lying exactly where it had fallen months earlier, and I thought about how much had happened in the 11 days since I'd first seen it, and how little anyone standing on the other side of that town, the neighbors, the church congregation, the local paper Vanessa had personally invited, actually understood about what they were about to walk into. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the lease termination notice I'd carefully removed and photographed and preserved days earlier, the same document I planned to hold, in my own hand, in front of the entire town in 3 days' time. I ran my thumb along its folded edge, the paper gone soft at the creases from being handled so many times in the last 11 days, and I thought about Margaret's notebook sitting on my nightstand at home, and I made her, silently, in that empty gravel lot, the same promise I'd been carrying since the first morning I'd stood in this exact spot. Whatever was about to happen at that reopening, our son was going to walk out of it with the truth finally standing in the open air where it belonged, and no one, not Vanessa, not Preston Vance, not anyone who had ever mistaken a quiet man for an easy target, was going to walk away from it, pretending they hadn't known exactly what they'd built. The morning of the reopening came in gray and threatening rain, the kind of sky that makes you wonder if the universe is trying to warn somebody. I put on a plain gray sport coat over a white shirt, nothing fancy, because I have never once needed a costume to say the things I needed to say that day. I put the lease termination notice in my inside pocket, folded carefully in a plastic sleeve Ruth had given me to keep it from tearing. I picked up Margaret's notebook from my nightstand and, for reasons I couldn't fully explain even to myself, slipped it into my coat pocket alongside the notice. 2 pieces of paper, one that proved a lie, one that had helped me see through it. Daniel met me in the driveway. He looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier, the way people do after they've had to grow up fast in the middle of an ordinary life. "You don't have to say anything if this goes sideways," he told me. "I mean that. If it gets to be too much, you let me carry it." "Son," I said, "I've spent 31 years learning how to say exactly the right thing, at exactly the moment. Nobody wants to hear it. This is the one time in my life that training was actually built for." The crowd outside the shop that morning was bigger than either of us expected. Maybe 60 people, neighbors, a handful of Daniel's old customers, 3 members of our church, a reporter and a photographer from the local paper standing near the front with a camera already up, and a red ribbon stretched across the newly cleaned front door, which meant Vanessa had paid someone, with whose money I couldn't yet say for certain, to at least sweep the floor and hang new blinds in the window since I'd last stood there. Preston Vance was near the back of the crowd, in a gray suit that fit a little too well for a man with 2 outstanding civil judgments against him, smiling like a man who believed, right up until the very last second, that he was watching someone else's problem play out from a safe distance. Vanessa stood at the front, near the ribbon, radiant, practiced, thanking the crowd for their support during what she called a hard season for our family. Her hand resting on Daniel's arm, like she'd never once looked at him and calculated exactly how much more he could be squeezed for. She spotted me near the back of the crowd and her smile flickered, just barely, the way a candle flickers when a door opens somewhere in the house. She said it before I'd even taken 3 steps toward the front. Quiet enough that only the people closest heard it first, but sharp enough that it carried. "I hope you're not here to make this harder than it needs to be, Jerry. Some of us actually understand what it takes to keep a family business alive." And then, louder, for the small cluster of neighbors nearby, with a little laugh meant to soften it into a joke that wasn't a joke at all. Margaret always did baby him too much. I think that's half of why he never learned to let go of things. The crowd went quiet in a strange, physical way, not silent exactly, because somewhere a car alarm 2 streets over kept chirping in the distance, and a child near the front kept humming to herself, oblivious, but every adult face nearby had gone still. The particular stillness of people who've just watched someone say a thing they can't unsay. Daniel's jaw tightened. I felt something in my own chest go very cold and very clear, the way it does right before you stop feeling anything, except exactly what needs to happen next. I have been called worse things by better people. I have sat across desks from men trying to steal widows' homes and let their insults slide off me like rain. But nobody in 62 years had ever used my late wife's grave to score a point in front of a crowd. And something about hearing Margaret's name in that woman's mouth, twisted into a weapon, burned through every ounce of patience I'd carefully rationed out over the last 11 days. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters more than anything I actually said. I walked to the front of that crowd, stopped a few feet from the ribbon, and looked directly at her. My wife, I said, spent 30 years teaching a boy to be gentle in a world that keeps telling men gentleness is weakness. You're standing in front of a business you helped strip down to bare concrete, invoking her name to shame him for loving too easily. I'd think very carefully before you finish that sentence. Vanessa's smile didn't fully drop. Not yet. You don't know what you're talking about, she said. This shop is opening today, right now, because your money finally came through. That's the first true thing you've said all morning, I said. My money did come through. It's sitting in a protective trust that requires proof of an actual operating business before a single dollar releases. So let's talk about proof. I reached into my coat and took out the lease termination notice in its plastic sleeve, and I held it up, not shouting, not performing, just holding it steady in the gray morning light so the reporter's camera and every phone already quietly recording around us could see it clearly. This shop closed 4 months ago, I said. Not 3 weeks. 4 months. The lease was terminated. The equipment was sold. Not to save this business, to pay off a personal debt. I turned just slightly, toward the back of the crowd, toward the man in the gray suit whose smile had finally begun to fail him. A debt owed to Preston Vance. The reaction moved through that crowd like a current through water, fast, physical, unmistakable. Somebody gasped. 2 women near the front turned to stare at Vanessa, then at Preston, connecting a line neither of them had thought to draw before that exact second. Preston took 1 step backward, bumped into a woman holding a coffee cup, muttered an apology that nobody accepted, and I watched him do the math on his own face. Watched him understand, in real time, that whatever quiet exit he'd been counting on was no longer available to him. Vanessa's composure finally cracked all the way open. You don't understand what you're doing, she hissed. Low, only for me and Daniel now, the performance for the crowd forgotten. You're going to ruin everything. No, Daniel said. And this was the moment, the one I will remember for the rest of my life, my son's voice steady in a way I hadn't heard it since before his mother died. You already ruined it. He's just the one who finally said it out loud. He turned to the crowd, to the reporter with her pen frozen over her notebook, to the neighbors who'd shown up that morning genuinely rooting for him. This shop has been closed since spring. I didn't know that until 11 days ago. I'm sorry to every single person standing here who came out today believing something that wasn't true. That's on us to fix, not on you to forgive right this second. That was when the second thing happened. The thing that turned a painful morning into something closer to justice. A car pulled up at the edge of the gravel lot, unhurried. No lights, no siren, just an ordinary sedan. And 2 people got out in plain clothes with badges clipped to their belts. Ruth had made a call 3 days earlier. Once the settlement documents from Preston's prior victims confirmed a pattern serious enough to cross from a civil matter into something the Financial Crimes Division wanted to look at directly. And she'd arranged, quietly, for an investigator to simply be present that morning, watching, in case anything at this public event corroborated what the paperwork already suggested. It did. Preston Vance. standing in a gray suit in front of 60 witnesses and a newspaper camera, holding a folder of loan documents he'd foolishly brought along that morning to make the reopening look legitimate. Was not a hard man to have a conversation with. Once one of those investigators walked up and asked to see what was in that folder, he didn't get arrested on the spot, not dramatically, not the way it might happen in a movie. He simply got asked to step aside and answer some questions, calmly, and the moment he did, whatever authority he'd been performing for months evaporated out of him like air out of a punctured tire. I watched a con man become, in the space of about 90 seconds, just a tired, frightened, ordinary man standing in a gravel lot answering questions he didn't have good answers to. Vanessa didn't run. I'll give her that much. She stood very still next to the ribbon she'd never gotten to cut, staring at Preston being led toward that sedan, and something in her face broke apart that had nothing to do with getting caught, and everything, I think, to do with finally seeing clearly what she'd let herself become part of. She turned to Daniel. I was going to fix it, she said. Quiet now, all performance gone. I kept telling myself one more loan, one more, and it would all go back to normal before anyone had to know. I know, Daniel said, and I want you to notice that he didn't say it cruelly. I understand wanting to fix something quietly instead of admitting it's broken. I understand that better than you think. He looked at her for a long moment. I hope you get help. I mean that. But I can't be the person standing next to you while you figure out how. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. This wasn't that kind of ending, and I think that's exactly as it should have been, because real justice rarely arrives with applause. It arrives quiet and heavy and a little bit sad, even when it's necessary, even when it's right. Before we left the lot that morning, I did one more thing I hadn't planned. I found Daniel standing alone by the empty showroom window, staring at that same overturned folding chair still lying inside on its side, and I told him something I should have told him weeks earlier, back when this whole thing started with a phone call at 11:47 at night. I owe you an apology too, I said. 6 years of being polite to Vanessa instead of paying attention to her. 6 years of telling myself keeping the peace was the same thing as loving you well. It wasn't. I should have asked harder questions a long time before this became something I had to unravel with a legal pad and a lease notice. Daniel didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't, not entirely, and I respected him for not pretending otherwise. He just put his hand on my shoulder, the same way I'd put mine on his 11 days earlier, and said, we both stopped looking at things we were scared of. I think that's the part we actually have to fix going forward. Not just this. It took 4 months for the rest of it to settle. Preston Vance was charged with multiple counts of fraud tied to his pattern of predatory lending, and the 2 prior civil judgments against him, once public and connected, gave the district attorney's office more than enough to build a real case that didn't depend only on what happened to Vanessa. He is currently awaiting trial, and from what Ruth tells me, it isn't looking like a short sentence, if it comes to that. Vanessa and Daniel finalized their divorce quietly, without a public fight, in large part because Daniel insisted on it. He didn't want a second spectacle, not after the first one had already told the truth loudly enough for everyone who needed to hear it. She moved 2 towns over, started attending some kind of financial counseling program Ruth had quietly recommended, and I hope, honestly, that she finds her way to something steadier than what she'd built her life on before. I don't carry hatred for her the way I might have expected to, back in that gravel lot at dawn. I carry something closer to a tired kind of sorrow for a woman who let fear turn into a lie so large it swallowed a business, a marriage, and very nearly my son's trust in himself. Whitfield Precision Auto reopened for real about 5 months later, smaller than before, in a different building 2 blocks from the old one, with Daniel running it entirely on his own name, his own lease, his own signature on every document, and my $30,000 released, finally, exactly as it had always been intended, not to cover somebody else's secret, but to buy real tools for a real business his father could walk through with his head up. I still drive out there sometimes, on quiet mornings, just to see the lights on early, the bay doors open, my son's hands moving under the hood of somebody's car, exactly the way they used to when he was 28 years old, and certain the whole world was going to work out fine. I sit in my truck in that gravel lot for a minute before I go in, the same gravel lot where I once stood at dawn and found an empty building and a folding chair knocked over on its side. It isn't empty anymore, and neither, finally, is the space in our family where 6 years of my own polite silence used to sit. My wife wrote, in a notebook I still keep on my nightstand, that love should never be allowed to curdle into control, and that we should watch for it in the people who claim to love us most. I'd add one more line to hers now, if I could still hand her a pen. Watch, too, for the quiet places in your own life where you've stopped asking hard questions because the answers frightened you. That is where the truth waits longest, and it does not go away simply because you've decided not to look at it.